So I'm a computer scientist, I guess, but I mostly work on problems that look like this. So this is an intensive care unit patient in the neurological intensive care unit at Columbia, where my collaborator runs this, tries to treat patients, and has really complex life. It has all these different sensors. They're not talking to each other. My interest is trying to make sense of this kind of data and see if we can find causal models that maybe help him better treat patients. I have no ability to intervene. We can't do randomized trials. I have no ability to change what's measured about the patients. So life is quite difficult. But on the other hand, humans are making these decisions every day and working in these environments. And so the hope is to make this a little bit easier with technology. It's also been weird being a computer scientist, sort of working on causality for about 15 years. There's been ebbs and flows in people's interest in this, and lots of people say things along these lines that maybe for making predictions, we don't really care how things work. We just need to know that they work. My favorite part about this quote was it was written by a former Google employee after Google flu really failed spectacularly and was predicting cases of the flu really well, and then all of a sudden failed and was predicting twice as many cases as there were. So it seems like maybe there's something else we need other than just prediction. And so the thing I think we need is causality. So I've devoted a lot of time to trying to get causal relationships from this observational data. We have no hope of experimenting, can't change anything about what's measured. We have different things measured for different patients, different things measured over time. There's huge amounts of confounding. I've wrote some books about that. And then over the last 5 years, I've come to believe that causality isn't enough. We need something more than that. And I think the something more is where everyone here comes in, because it's an understanding of people and human behavior, which we're really missing in our computational causal models. And so I spent 5 years trying to analyze this data that came from stroke patients. The goal was to try to understand just what's happening during recovery. We had a lot of problems with missing data that we worked to solve. After 5 years, we came up with this. So this is a causal model. This is not a Bayes net. Anything here that looks like a Bayes net is not a Bayes net, just so you know. So don't be alarmed when you see cycles and things. There's also hidden time. I'm not showing you all these relationships. They could be positive, they could be negative. They have different intensity. They have different time windows. Not showing you any of that because I don't know how to visualize it in a nice way. If you have thoughts on that, let me know. And this is what we found. So we're looking at 2 different periods right after stroke. There was the first 96 hours, and the next period where doctors thought there might be this transition. And these are just the variables related to the brain. So this is not everything that was measured. And what we're seeing here is, in general, one, there's more causal relationships later on, which was interesting. Maybe things are reorganizing as the patients recover. And also the causes of brain swelling, which none of these variables are things you're going to know. That's fine. TW%, the thing at the bottom, relates to brain swelling. The cause of that changed over time, which is interesting because if the causes of the thing that doctors care about are changing, maybe your interventions also have to change over time. So that was really exciting to me. But the whole model looked like this. And after 5 years, I was like, you have a causal model. I believe it. This is really cool. And my very blunt collaborator said, this is an unholy mess. And he was not as excited as I was. We spent about 3 hours going over the model. I was answering his questions. Why is this thing not there? I'm like, well, it never changes. And so without any variation, I can't find any causal relationships. Other things are only measured in people who are unconscious. And so again, lack of variation. Some things are measured at the wrong time scale. And so you're only seeing things at equilibrium, another problem we had. And so we went through this process of like me trying to explain to him why things he expected to see weren't there, why other things were there. Eventually he kind of bought into it, but it wasn't the reaction I was looking for. I was expecting like, I've solved all of your problems and you're going to use this to treat patients, and like, this is amazing, you know, we're done here. We've solved stroke recovery. But I don't think it was unique to me or this diagram. You see these kinds of things in a lot of places. This is a really well-known diagram created to model obesity. It was intended to help policymakers. And since it was created, this is the 4-state obesity map. It's been mostly used to show, wow, obesity is really complicated and I don't know what we can do about it, right? And so if you imagine you're trying to figure out what's going to be the effect of your policy, right? Which of these things can you change? And if you come up with a policy to change one of them, what are its effects going to be, right? It's almost impossible to look at that and figure that out. And then once I started thinking about this, these kinds of diagrams are everywhere. These things that we think are helpful are also just used to argue that some things are hopeless. This was a diagram about the Afghanistan war. McChrystal said, once we understand the slide, we'll be able to win the war. It was also used with Obamacare. And so this was, the Republicans said, basically, this is what's going to be between you and your doctor, right? And so this is going to be the result of Obamacare. This is a terrible policy, basically, right? Because there's going to be this overwhelming complexity. I was hoping to find a diagram showing Taylor Swift's effect on the local economy. Couldn't find that, so homework for people. But there are tons of these diagrams, right? Because all these systems are really, really complicated. And if we want to find these accurate models of what's happening, they're going to be complicated. I started to worry that, we haven't really tested, is this helping people make decisions? As a computer scientist, our evaluations look like this. They all vary a little bit, but they're pretty much similar in flavor. Do we find more of the correct causal relationships? And do we find fewer wrong ones, right? And our value system is more is better, right? If we find more of the correct relationships, obviously we've done a better job. Our algorithm is better than the other algorithm. And if we find fewer wrong things, right? Well, that's good. We want to make fewer mistakes. But it encodes this idea that every causal relationship is equal. We're just counting up the number that we find, and that we want to find the maximum number. Sometimes we also look at how much data we need or runtime or things like that. But really our evaluation is based on, do we find more? None of that really has to do with how well people can use causal models. So I thought, well, computer scientists, we don't know a lot about people clearly based on some of the things we built, but psychologists too, right? And you all have a lot of very positive news, right? Children are great at finding causal models. That was really nice. My collaborator with an MD PhD who actually does brain surgery is not, so had some concerns there. But overall, this was uplifting, right? That people can find causal models and use them in a variety of situations, right? Quite reliably. But there's also a disconnect. These are generally much simpler than the kinds of models I give to my collaborator. And my collaborator already has a lot of hypotheses about what's going to happen, right? He knows a lot about the brain. He knows a lot about physiology. In some cases, it might be hard to change his mind because he's had a lot of evidence about some of these things. And so he's not coming in with a blank slate, right? Where he's just trying to, learn how this new room works. He's coming in with these ideas and trying to put them together with the causal model. It's about 5 years ago, I started wondering, can the kinds of models that we find with machine learning and AI help people make choices in familiar situations? So not this, blank slate robots and aliens, but everyday choices like what should we have for breakfast or things like that. So I'll show you a series of experiments. They're all large online studies. One was Mechanical Turk, the rest are all prolific studies. And they look kind of like this. And so this is, a familiar situation. You have a person here, they have some constraints, they have a goal, and they have some options. And the important thing is their options aren't, turn variable A on or off. It's an actual action you might take in the world. And so I might give you a diagram that tells you about, carbohydrates and fat can work together to slow the rise of blood sugar, but you're at a break at a conference and have a few options of food and have to decide which one to eat, right? You're not intervening on, grams of carbohydrate and fat. You're deciding, should I have that croissant or not? Should I have some coffee? What's going to be the effect of that, right? So there are all these very specific actions we have to take. At this point, I was still sort of hopeful. And I thought this is kind of like taking an open book exam. We gave some people no diagram. Some people saw a causal model that looks like this. And some people saw the same information in text. So there might be a difference in how information is presented. And thus began the disillusionment. We did this, and after all this time spending my life arguing we need causal models, people did worse with causal models. And it was really fun giving a talk about this to my funding agencies who funded all this work. We found the causal models. The positive news is people are actually pretty good. They know what they should do. With no information, accuracy was 89%. But it plummets with the causal models, and it didn't really matter if they were text or diagrams. Causal information seemed to hurt. So this was quite distressing. We looked at lots of different things. Are they spending time with it? The more information we show people, the more time they spend on the problem. They're not ignoring it. They're doing worse. We looked at how they felt about their decisions. They were becoming less confident. So not only were they making worse choices, they were less confident about them. And the people who were confident shouldn't have been. And something changed when we started looking at domains where some people had experience and others didn't. And there we found a difference. So people who had some experience, they were doing worse. People who had no experience started to do better. And all these people also did control questions like with aliens, robots, and did just fine. And so it seemed to be something about having this prior knowledge. However, we know that a lot of what people know is wrong. We all have lots of incorrect beliefs, often about health, but we don't necessarily know that, right? So we thought maybe if we help people realize there's a gap in their knowledge, we can come in with our causal models and we can fill that gap. So that was the next study, trying to change what people think they know, make them more receptive to the models, see how that goes. We tried 2 different things. This also worked with Jessica Marsh, who's in the back, and maybe endorses things I'm saying, maybe doesn't. And we tried 2 different things. One, subjective, so illusion of explanatory depth. People rate how much they know about things like how type 2 diabetes develops, write out the whole causal story of how people develop diabetes, re-rate their knowledge. We saw the expected drop in knowledge. And we also tried just giving them a quiz with and without feedback. And so there are quizzes about diabetes knowledge, true, false. People actually realize when they're guessing, and so they don't actually need the feedback of this work, which is interesting. So we did these 2 different things to see if we do this before we give you a diagram, we maybe realize you need the help and use it a little bit better. Was not the case. And so the best we had here was the causal model, the interventions to help you realize limits to your knowledge, inoculated you against the drop, but didn't make a causal model better than nothing. And so basically, causal model, no information was same in accuracy. And without the intervention, people had worse results. And it didn't really matter which intervention it was, the results were the same. So for a long time, that was the most positive result I have, is causal models are as good as nothing, which is really, really depressing. Again, spending my whole life learning causal models and arguing why they're really important. And so I realized my mental model of the causal model was like this, that you have this gap in your knowledge, I'm coming in with my causal model, I'm filling this gap perfectly, and you should be really grateful and excited. And it's actually more like this, that I'm giving this causal model, you are in the situation where there are different gaps in your knowledge, and you really don't know necessarily how to fit this causal model in with what else is happening. And so trying desperately to get some positive results, we thought, well, maybe, what if we focus people's attention, right? So we're giving you the causal model, and we think about how we get health guidelines and other guidelines. They're often very generic and meant for multiple situations. And so if you look at American Heart Association or different health organizations, they give you guidance on blood pressure, weight management, things like that. And you have to pick out which parts of that are relevant for you, right? They're not just telling you, here's what you specifically should do. You're getting a number of different options and a number of different things and have to figure out from that what's important. And the same thing in our causal models, like the one that I showed my collaborator, these are meant for multiple situations, right? There are things related to brain swelling, brain temperature, blood pressure, all of that. And he has to figure out which parts are relevant, in addition to figuring out which interventions can affect these things. So we adapted that really complicated obesity diagram that's been derided into something that's still overwhelmingly complicated, but not quite as painful. And then developed a set of questions where there were different interventions that people could do related to diet. And we showed people in the simple condition, just the part of the diagram that they need. And so only the causal paths that were relevant for the choice, and didn't show them anything else. And compare that to this complicated condition. Questions were very similar to the other ones. Again, we have a person, they have some constraints, they have some goals, and they want to make one specific lifestyle choice to manage their weight here. And so this guy can just give up, say weight's genetic, can't do anything about it. Fast forward through TV commercials, get some takeout, add vegetables, and so on. So finally here we had some positive results. Simple diagrams helped, basically. Once we put blinders on people, gave them just the relevant information, suddenly causal models were helping people make better choices. I felt better about my choice to study causal models. And the node diagram and complex diagram were basically the same. So that was not so great. The other interesting thing was in the question I showed on the previous slide, we gave people a causal chain. And in that question, we didn't give them just what was needed. We gave them what was needed plus one extra node to see how that would change their preferences. And what was interesting was simplicity can also push around people's preferences. People like to intervene on root nodes. This is well known. And by making something seem more like a root, that suddenly becomes a much more popular answer, which also suggests there's some downside when you're simplifying your models, because you might make something seem more prominent and like a more likely intervention target if it seems like a root in your simplified model. So we were quite excited by this. We again had positive results finally after many years. We expanded to a lot of different domains outside of health. So we looked at lifestyle choices, picking college, voting, increasing voter turnout, saving for retirement, health-related things in all these domains, applied the same thing, found the same results. So that was really exciting. This replicated across 16 different topics in 4 different domains. So same things seem to be happening. We also tested what happens if we just highlight the relevant paths. So highlight them in orange, even though people see the whole model, had the same effect. So that was good. You don't have to just, show people one part of the model. You can show the whole model and just focus people's attention. Question was, why is this happening? Is it just, any extra information? Is it about the amount of extra information? So we tried adding just a couple extra nodes and edges, see what would happen. Call that simple plus. And it turns out basically any amount of extra information is bad. And people in that condition had the same results as the complex diagram and no information. And so it was anything whatsoever that was extraneous and not relevant for the decision led to worse choices. One question you might have after that is, you might think, I'm a person who needs all the research, or I like to really read up on stuff before I make a choice. I see all these results and think, well, I would do better with complex information, right? In all the other experiments, we randomized people to the conditions. So here we tested, what if we let people choose? And they can make different choices for each of the 16 domains. And so they would see at the beginning, here's what it would look like if you choose most complicated information, simplest information, different things for one question. Your next question is going to be about increasing voter turnout. How much information do you want? And so people could choose, and also they could see over time how much information, what it would look like, and change their choices. So in terms of what people pick, the most popular answer is the simplest model, which is good because that turns out to be the best model. But people do still pick no information, or say that they want a little bit extra information or the complex diagram. And once again, we find the same thing as the other experiments. The simplest diagram is the most helpful one. And so that's the best choice. Whereas for people who think that they need the most complex diagram, turns out they're not right. Complex diagrams here and no information were basically tied for last. So people who think that they don't actually need any help and they know everything, or that they really need all the details, didn't have the ability to predict that. The other sort of interesting thing we found was this was a much larger experiment than the others. We had 1,200 participants, and so we could look at demographic differences. And we found significant differences in gender, also education. Unfortunately for graduate students, highest levels of education were not helpful for making good decisions. People with less education made better choices, and consistently with every information level, women made better choices. You can see there's also distinct differences in confidence levels across these groups. Unfortunately, it didn't mediate the effect, but we measured confidence at the end, and it's possible with a different measure of confidence that might explain things, because these are both really strongly correlated. Okay. So going back to Lauren's talk this morning, we think of what computer scientists find and how we evaluate what we find. All the causes are the same, right? We're not thinking like, is this a cause that's modifiable? Is this a weaker cause, a faster acting cause, a stronger cause, right? We're just treating them all the same and assuming that more is better. But maybe some of those would be better for being able to modify things, right? And thinking that we need to prioritize what we show people, we probably should be evaluating them differently and thinking about what kinds of causes are we finding, and then show people, here's what you can actually modify or act on, right? So if we model type 2 diabetes, genetics is a risk factor, but you also can't change it, right? And so maybe showing people things that are not modifiable, given the effect of complexity, is not super helpful. But this is not currently how we evaluate machine learning and AI. So I'll just finish by saying now my current belief is we need causes for action, but definitely the most complete model is not immediately useful, right? There's some extra step we need after we find the causal model to make it valuable for a person to make decisions from. I need to think about new ways of evaluating AI machine learning, right? Just looking at precision recall is not enough. There's something else to figure out what makes a model useful and how we can present them in ways that are useful to people. So I'll say thanks to all the collaborators and funding agencies. Okay.
Great talk. So one thing I'm curious about, so in all these vignettes, these are like real world situations where people presumably have their own intuitive model of how this works. So is it the case where there might be some sort of incongruency between the model you're showing me and the model I think, and what you see is the results of me trying to bring those together. So imagine like a new situation where there's a totally novel experience that has no real world basis. Would you expect differences if you're, providing all of that as opposed to that?
Yeah, so great question. Absolutely. In most of these experiments, we've done this. I didn't show the last one. We had a controlled condition with like an alien dance-off. And presumably, people have no experience with alien dance-offs, and they do fine, and the results are totally different. We've done other work trying to get people's mental models, and done a lot of work trying to figure out how do we know if we're right, and what does it mean to like get people's accurate mental model, which is a hard question by itself. We've also done think aloud studies where people describe what they're doing when they answer the questions. So it's qualitative data. And there you see people are adding so much extra stuff in that's not in there. And they're like, well, if she does this, then maybe she'll walk to work every day, and then like she'll get a dog, and like all this other stuff is going to happen. And so it's going to have this like snowball effect, and that'll be better. But none of that's in the model.
Right.
And that's part of, I think, why it's so different when the other condition, like you can't add in all this other stuff about, the duplicates, because it's not like rich environment that you can sort of contribute to. Whereas this other stuff, you can think, oh, it's hard for me to take medication, or I don't like medication. People write a lot. People are over medicated, or it's hard to do two things. You should start small and do one thing, even though it's not optimal. And so they think about all this extra stuff. It's really hard to change those models, which is the other thing is we've had people draw the models before and after. One hypothesis we had was maybe there are people who were combining into one model and they did better than people who kind of maintained two models. But it turned out that basically everyone who was trying to combine into one model weren't doing it well. And so maybe that's a place to intervene, is to help them build the model or give them feedback on the model. I don't know. No competition.
So I'd like to go back to the question of complex models of prediction. So in computer science, especially, there's a lot of talk about generalization to, let's say, build out samples, but not necessarily a lot of talk about generalization to domains in parallel, different contexts. And where the complex models that seem to fail most might be in generalization to others. Other contexts.
It's possible maybe there's a subset of the model that generalizes, and there's other parts of the model that are specific to some domain or topic.
So you've shown that from complex models and stable models on the reference sites. Related to the first question, if you go to the situation, you just give me an answer. So
that's my initial motivation. I was like, well, people don't follow guidelines, right? So maybe if I tell you the causal story, like maybe you'll believe that and take it. On my to-do list is comparing if we just give you, a directive versus giving you something causal, if there's a difference there, but we don't. And it might be there that it's a little bit different, like in a real world situation, like with your doctor, and there's no explanation at all for how the medication works or what it's going to do versus like some explanation versus these are maybe lower stakes. So I've done a lot of experiments that are not published here because we thought that there'd be some effect of like the model sort of topology, that like density might be an effect or number of nodes and edges might have different effects. It wasn't the case at all. We were in so many experiments and the only thing that mattered was the number of nodes, which was really disappointing because there was just no feature of like cycles or, I really thought it surprised me a lot that density had no effect.
So in the case where you had a thing and it worked, and then you had one I think that was merely that, like, it wasn't that it was merely that but like
no, so they were small enough, right, that like you could hold it in your memory. They were also sort of chosen in a way when possible that they could rule out an answer. So we maybe added one that said like alcohol is bad for sleep, right? And then one of your options is like have a glass of wine before bed. And so it should kind of help you rule out a second answer. I think it just gives you opportunity to overthink, right? I see it like when I give students exams, right? That there's a question that I think is so easy And I get so many questions during the exam about the question because they don't think it could possibly be that easy.
It could be pragmatic implication, right? The fact that you gave them those codes, you're relating them to.
Yeah, it's possible. But it's also how people get guidance, right? They get extra information, and so they are invited to use that.
People disagree and not understand their analysis of impossible. Suppose you actually set it up so that you can intervene on one of the positive, and then you could actually see the effect on the other pause that would be easy enough to do. And I wonder if that would change how likely people really take the seriously. A nice experimentation.
I do think the results might be different if people could interact with the causal models. The problem is like then thinking about giving health guidance, nutrition guidance, some of the domains I work. It's not feasible for people to always interact with the model when you give them information. At some point, you have to be able to provide static information. And so the hope is to figure out how we can do that effectively.
It's not going to be hard to have it's not going to be hard to have a screen that has a text.
No, but I mean, like in a reality, like a doctor's office where they're giving you something, it's like, come interact with my causal model and you can make some predictions versus like, here's some information about how this medication might work, or how this might change your odds of survival.